Today we're going to introduce Chris McCandless and your idea of the story of Into the Wild. So Christopher McCandless had written, "I've decided I'm going to live this life for some time to come. The freedom and simple beauty is just too good to pass up." But before we get into Chris's story, let's learn more about the author of Into the Wild. Jon Krakauer is a writer and he's an avid mountain climber. Now his writing career picked up with the Outside magazine because he was an avid mountain climber. He would write about doing outside activities, but he's also written for other publications, including the New York Times. Currently, he's written several novels, the most acclaimed being Into Thin Air, which is an account of his successful yet disastrous climb of Mount Everest. So when he decides to write Into the Wild, he started writing an article for Outside magazine. He had great popularity with it, and therefore, when it was published in January 1993, people had more questions. So he decides to write the book, and it was published in 1996 and spent 2 years on the New York Times bestseller list. So if we take a look at a bit about the themes or what it is we're about to learn in Into the Wild, we do have, again, the quote from Chris McCandless, "The freedom and simple beauty is just too good to pass up. He'd like to live." And so when we take a look at the other pictures, we kind of wonder what picture holds the most value and the least value for all of us. And then we'll wonder the same for Chris. Meet Chris, otherwise known as Alex. As we know from Jim Gallion that Chris McCandless, or Alex, was by Alaskan standards somewhat unprepared for his journey into the wilderness. Now Gallion said McCandless's pack looked far too small for such an adventure, and that his boots were junk. However, he seemed intent upon getting away because he's going so far as to tell Gallion that he no longer needed his watch because he wasn't going to be needing it out in the woods. Now, Jim Gallion is the one who takes Chris, or Alex, on his last trip into the Alaskan wilderness. And because Jim thought his boots were junk, he gave him his own pair of boots. And so there was a bit of a trade here between the watch and the boots. So what do we know about Chris McCandless? Well, he was a high achiever in academics, in athletics, in music. Anything that Chris tried to do, he seemed to do fantastically well. He was a very generous and caring guy. A lot of times when we hear from his sister or from some of the few buddies that he would have in college, he seemed to be quite caring towards others. And with the people that he worked with along his way out west and then up north into Alaska, he seemed to want to give away everything he had. He also happened to be self-absorbed and quite impatient with others. Because he's such a high achiever and can do everything easily, he would get impatient with others who would not seem to be as hardworking and determined as him, and he was very absorbed in what he wanted and not what other people wanted. He, being kind of eccentric himself, was quite tolerant of other eccentric people, which he met along his way out west. He seems to be quite passionate about what it is that he's thinking of or working on in the moment. He's a very harsh judge of character. You had to be as self-determined and self-absorbed, or he probably wouldn't like you. But he was also intensely private. I mean, after all, people knew him as Alex because he didn't want people to know his past. And he was very socially conscious. He wanted to go off into the woods, but he also wanted to preserve it, to take care of it. He liked the beauty of nature. So with everything he had here, he would be quite the successful man today. And yet he decides to leave society, all of his academics, everything he leaves behind. Now back to the author. Krakauer's use of methodology in Into the Wild is an important focus of the biography. It's inevitably what makes him a partial biographer. After all, he uses a lot of Chris McCandless's journals and other things that he's left behind. Now, methodology is the methods of organizing principles underlying a particular art, science, or other area of study. So he is doing a biography on Chris McCandless, but he's also going to use manuscripts that Chris had left behind, maps that people have drawn for him, interviews with people who had met Chris/Alex along the way, and then finally epigraphs. With the structure, Krakauer starts the novel with the ending completely in mind. You know about Chris's death by chapter 2. The epigraph is detailing his trip into the Yukon Territory, and Westerberg's letter that is published in Krakauer's novel is introduced even before he is. Maps, of course, are also used to personalize the Odyssey. After all, there's a lot of traveling that's involved in Into the Wild, so it's kind of helpful for people, especially of an international flair, to kind of know where it is that Chris went. Now, the visual rendering here that we have, for example, is where Chris has been. We can see Chris's plight and the treks that he has made. For example, the one that you're looking at is his last parts of his trip where he's in Alaska. You can also see the absurdity of his journey. He jumps from one place to the next, to the next. There's X's all over the area. So we take a look at letters and manuscripts that he has owned or he has written. It's a personal connection to Chris. He seems to be very candid and very real in the letters. Now, the detection of his spite and anger and arrogance, his self-absorbedness, is throughout all of Chris's writing. And it puts on a different face in front of strangers. He looks very benevolent, very spirited, and very kind to people that he wants them to think that he's benevolent, spirited, and kind. These letters also serve as his connections to the outside world, his evidence of his journey, and his eventual bitter farewell to society. So one of the people you meet in Krakauer's novel is Jan Burris, and this happens to be a postcard that has been written by Chris to Jan. Of course, because we interviewed only about a year after Chris's death, Jon Krakauer has a lot of interviews from people who still actively remembered Chris. And the story becomes real when we meet the people that Chris has befriended and provides a very personal account of his behavior. And it starts to make us question his motives. We see a lot of friendships that he's created, a lot of societies that he had started making himself a part of. And so then we become aware of his inability to connect to humans. Even though these humans who have been interviewed connected to Chris, he must not have really connected to them. This is also Krakauer's main attempt at trying to be an impartial biographer, giving other people room to tell their stories about Chris. Now, Krakauer also saw a lot of connections between Chris and himself, from their interests to their worldviews to even their family lives. And of course, he said, "I identify with him a lot, and it's a sad story. I went back to the bus for the 3rd time last September. I've become quite good friends with his family. We have this sort of weird bond." So as you start reading Jon Krakauer's Into the Wild and learn more about Chris McCandless, perhaps ask yourself about the idea of heroes. Heroes often embody the qualities of a culture. Perhaps examine Chris McCandless as a possible hero. What evidence is there that he's a hero to Americans? What qualities does he have that represents their own culture and what Americans value? You might also want to ask about the idea of self and what might be most important in life. Is it your friends, is it your family, or is it yourself? Are families and friends or communities essential to our happiness in any way? And can a person be complete and content in a solitude or without the acceptance of society? Which of these could be most central to our happiness? And what does it mean to be a success? Lastly, when we talk about ourselves, how do we construct our own identities? What is the relationship between nature and the identity of Americans? And in what other ways do we form our identities? We also have Americans always being captivated about the idea of traveling, specifically traveling west, or as Wallace Stegner wrote, "The road has always led west." Now, why do Americans have such an obsession with travel and the road trip? What does it reveal about American culture and the desires that many people seek out the adventure of the great unknown? Thank you so much for stopping by for this introduction of Into the Wild and a little bit of an introduction to Chris McCandless. If you have more questions, if you want to hear more about the actual book itself, please leave some comments down below and let me know if you'd like to hear me go through some of the chapters of the book. And as always, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel.